Hey guys, welcome to the basic tutorial for LRTimelapse. In this tutorial, you will learn the complete workflow for editing a timelapse from the image sequence to the perfect video clip. You can do this workflow with or without Lightroom Classic. In this video, I will show you both variants. If you want to start a little bit slower, you might want to check out my short basic tutorial without Lightroom. Later, you can still come back here to learn how to add Lightroom to your workflow. In this tutorial, you will learn how to define and edit keyframes in LRTimelapse and Lightroom Classic, apply Holy Grail compensations if needed, automatically calculate all transitions and deflicker your timelapses. The result will be a super smooth video from your timelapse image sequence. Enjoy! First of all, each timelapse sequence must be stored in a specific folder. A folder with a timelapse sequence should not have any further subfolders. In the LRTimelapse settings, on the Folder tab, you can configure the folders to be displayed in the tree. I would advise you to define the parent folders under which your time-lapses are located here. This increases the overall performance and makes things more organized. Select any folder in the tree to load the sequence into LRTimelapse. Timelapse sequences can consist of raw, DNG or JPEG files. The workflow is the same for all these file types. However, the quality of the result and the processing speed is highest with raw files. Therefore, you should use these whenever possible. Conversion from raw to DNG is not necessary and it's usually counterproductive. You can playback your timelapse directly after loading it using the preview in the top corner. Those images are of course not yet edited. On the right side, there is a table with so-called metadata. Metadata is information about the images such as exposure time, aperture, and interval. The editing steps are also displayed as metadata in the table. Here, for example, in the column exposure, the exposure correction. The highlight of working with LRTimelapse is that all edits are first calculated virtually and only applied to the images in a single development process at the very end when the video is output. This lossless processing is one of the great advantages of LRTimelapse. It makes it possible to create timelapses in unique quality. When we play back the sequence, we can see how the light changes during the recording. The blue curve shows this brightness progression. The workflow buttons are located at the top of the screen. These buttons simplify working with LRTimelapse. Normally, you simply go through them from left to right, so you always know exactly what to do next. If you hover over a button with the mouse, you will see an explanation. Let's start with the Keyframes Wizard. Keyframes are those images that we are going to edit later. If you click on the Keyframes Wizard, you will get a suggestion for the number of keyframes, but this is only a rough guideline. You can easily change this number by moving the slider. To determine how many keyframes you need, simply look at the sequence and identify where you see significant changes. In this case, I think we will need one keyframe at the beginning, one in the middle, and one at the end. So in this example, we are going to have 3 keyframes created. If you need more, you can either use a slider or create keyframes manually by activating the keyframes icon on the left of the table. Another option is to press the 1 key when an image is selected. Next comes the so-called Holy Grail Wizard. This is intended for sequences that you have recorded using the Holy Grail method. This method has proven to be useful for recording day to night or night to day transitions. The timelapse is recorded normally in the camera's M mode, and exposure time and ISO are then adjusted as required when it gets dark or bright. This can be done manually or with the help of an app such as qDslrDashboard. There is a separate video from me on this. However, adjusting the camera exposure in this way during recording leads to a jump in the brightness curve. Multiple readjustments lead to a zigzag curve. The Holy Grail Wizard automatically compensates for this and makes appropriate corrections to smooth the sequence. The Holy Grail Wizard cannot be activated for sequences that were recorded without manual readjustment of the camera, as it's not required in this case and would be counterproductive. Now save the editing steps you have carried out as metadata. The images are not yet finally developed, but all processing steps are written to the so-called XMP files. LRTimelapse communicates with the RAW converter or Lightroom via these files. While the undeveloped camera previews are displayed in blue, the developed visual previews are displayed in pink. This applies to the icon in the workflow bar as well as to the luminance curve in the preview. You can switch between the camera previews and the visual previews using the Visual Previews button. This pre-development on the keyframes allows you on the one hand to roughly see the later brightness curve of the developed sequence and adjust if necessary. On the other hand, if you don't want to use Lightroom, you can now edit the keyframes directly with the internal tools of LRTimelapse. The internal editor in LRTimelapse uses the same tools as Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw. For simple edits or corrections, you can therefore save yourself the detour via Lightroom. The results are the same. Finer adjustments to the edits can be made using the plus/minus buttons. Once you have finished editing a keyframe, you should transfer the settings of the edited keyframe to the next keyframe as a starting point so that you only have to make modifications there. Edit all your keyframes from left to right using the previous edit as starting point for the next. If you are already happy with your internal editing, you can simply continue with the auto transition. Alternatively, I will now show you how to edit in Lightroom. Even if you can access the most important development tools in the LRTimelapse editor, Lightroom is still the first choice for more complex editing of keyframes. It offers a larger and faster preview, significantly more and more complex tools such as masks and extended export options. The good thing is you don't have to choose LRTimelapse or Lightroom exclusively when editing. You can also combine the two as we are doing here. Please make sure that you have already opened Lightroom Classic and the library module is selected. Otherwise, the following import will not work. Also, the folder with the sequence should not already be in the Lightroom catalog. If this is the case, please remove the sequence from Lightroom first. Import your sequence now. Simply drag the Lightroom icon from LRTimelapse into the Lightroom library. Drag and drop. Lightroom can sometimes be a bit tricky here. On the Mac, for example, the most reliable way is to drop it onto the Lightroom dock icon. On Windows, you can hover over the Lightroom badge on the taskbar and wait until Lightroom comes up to the foreground and then simply release your mouse over the Lightroom window. Usually, the import dialog with the sequence from LRTimelapse will now open. If not, you can also select the folder to import manually. Now it is very important that Add is selected at the top of the import dialog so that you actually add the selected folder and Lightroom does not create a copy of the images. Click on Import to finally transfer the sequence with the edits you have already made in LRTimelapse to Lightroom. Now you can set a filter to display only the keyframes. You will find special LRTimelapse filters in the toolbar and the filter bar of Lightroom. These filters were set up automatically when LRTimelapse was installed. Now select LRT keyframes here to display only the keyframes. All the LRTimelapse keyframes have 4 stars in Lightroom. In Lightroom you can now edit the keyframes from left to right in a similar way to the internal editor. Frequently used tools are the exposure and contrast adjustments in the basic settings and of course the white balance, whose animation plays a major role in time-lapse photography, for example to realistically realize day to night and night to day transitions. But of course you can also set the crop and straighten a tilted horizon. You can set the aspect ratio of the images to 16:9 here, which is commonly used for videos, but you can also do this later when rendering in LRTimelapse. Tools such as clarity and dehaze, which work depending on the content of the images, should be used with caution, as they can lead to unsightly shifts in contrast and color in time-lapses due to their dependence on the image content. For the use and animation of masks, like linear and radial gradient filters, LRTimelapse has already created a series of masks that you can and should use. There are 4 linear gradients and 2 circular gradients. You can animate these and only these with the help of the keyframes. And of course, you can animate the developed tools on the masks as well as their position and shape. Please do not add any new masks or delete any of the pre-initialized masks. You should also not change the 3 masks that are intended for internal use by LRTimelapse. After you have finished editing the first keyframe, hold down the Control key on Windows or the Command key on Mac and click on the second keyframe so that both are selected. Now use a special script LRT Sync Keyframes to transfer the settings from the first to the second keyframe. You can find the script in the Scripts menu. On Mac, this is a small scroll in the menu bar. On Windows, just says Scripts. This script copies all edits without overwriting certain adjustments that LRTimelapse has made in the background. Now you can make changes to the second keyframe and work your way through the keyframes from left to right by applying the sync script after each edit. Now switch back to the grid view of the library. You can do this by simply pressing the G key for grid view. Select all keyframes by either selecting the first keyframe and then the last one while holding down the Shift key, or simply by pressing Ctrl A or Command A on the Mac. When all keyframes are selected, go to the Metadata menu and select Save Metadata to Files. It's important to always save and load metadata with the grid view enabled, as saving from Develop module would only take the current image into account even if all images are selected. This is a known problem in Lightroom. Therefore, I recommend to always pressing the G key to switch to the library whenever you want to save or load metadata. No matter if you used Lightroom for editing or you did it in LRTimelapse, now it's time to move on to the second workflow row. LRTimelapse has already developed the freshly edited keyframes so that you can get a first impression on how they look. You can use the arrow buttons below the histogram to jump from one keyframe to the next. Also, you could just use Control and cursor key up and down to switch between the keyframes. The new pink curve now shows the brightness progression of the already developed images, the so-called visual previews. The yellow curve shows the values of the exposure tool, both for now only on the keyframes. At this point, usually I check the brightness of the keyframes by looking at the pink luminance curve. If necessary, I can now still make changes to the brightness by adjusting the exposure. Here you can see the brightness curve much better than in Lightroom. The next step is to calculate automatic transitions for all images between the keyframes. To do this, simply click on the Auto Transition. LRTimelapse now calculates the developments for all images between the keyframes and briefly displays the resulting curves. If you want to see the curves again, you can display them using the All button. The colors of the curves correspond to the headings of the table columns. Only curves and columns for actually animated tools are displayed. LRTimelapse now automatically creates visual previews for the entire sequence. Unlike camera previews, these visual previews have now been developed with your edits. When you play back the sequence now, you can judge if it's already perfect or if additional changes are required. Often at this stage, a sequence is not yet completely smooth, but shows a so-called flicker. You can see this during playback, but also on the pink curve, which then is not smooth. LRTimelapse can completely remove this flicker. To fully remove the flicker, it's advisable to set a reference area for the calculation of the luminance curve. This reference area should cover a part of an image that is not affected by natural desired changes in brightness, but instead shows the flicker as isolated as possible. This is often an area of the sky. If there are fast clouds in the sky or other objects passing by, then alternatively you should choose an area where less of those natural changes occur. The aim is to see the flicker as isolated as possible in the luminance curve. You can set the reference area by clicking and dragging on the preview. You can delete the area again by double-clicking. After releasing the mouse button, LRTimelapse recalculates the luminance curve. Now activate the visual deflicker. Use the smoothing slider to set how much the luminance curve should be smoothed out. If this slider is set to 0, the target curve will follow all bumps and there will be no deflicker. The higher the slider is set, the smoother the curve becomes. Of course, the aim is to find a setting that smooths out short-term flicker, but maintains medium and long-term changes to the luminance. You can either choose a single deflicker pass or a multi-pass deflicker that makes 2 or more passes to gradually remove the flicker. In this case, we will set up 2-pass, multi-pass deflicker and then click Apply. LRTimelapse now calculates the deflicker for images that deviate from the green curve. Perfectly aligned images will not be recalculated. With multi-pass deflickers, several passes are made, with the pink curve getting closer and closer to the ideal green curve. On each pass, less images have to be recalculated. All these calculations are lossless, which means that you can perform as many deflicker passes as you like without affecting the quality. This is because all adjustments are initially only calculated as metadata. They are only applied once when the video is finally exported and rendered. This gives you a video of the highest possible quality. On the left-hand side of the tree, you can see so-called workflow indicators, which show you which steps you have already carried out on a sequence. Here you can see from left to right the symbols for Keyframe, the Holy Grail Wizard, if applicable, the auto transition, the deflicker with the number of passes, and whether a sequence is already finished and has videos assigned to it. You can even detach the preview panel to have a larger view and better assess the preview. Exporting and rendering are 2 separate processes in LRTimelapse. When exporting, the images are finally developed and all processing steps are applied to the full-sized image files. The result of the export is a so-called intermediate sequence with developed image files, JPEG or TIFF. After that, this intermediate sequence is rendered, which means converted into a video. The reason for the split is that the time-consuming export process only has to be run through once. However, various video files can then be created from the intermediate sequence in different resolutions and with different post-processing options. There are again 2 options for exporting, either via Lightroom or directly from LRTimelapse. For the internal export, just click on Internal Export and Render. Now you will get asked for an export and render folder, which should always be separated from the folder that you use to store your original timelapse files. Now that we are using a restricted folder tree, we are kind of limited in selecting another folder. So let's globally add the folder Timelapse Done to our restricted tree to make it available. It's a folder where all the exported and rendered timelapses will get stored. Now that I added it here, you also can see it in the main tree. Now select this Timelapse Done folder and click on Export and Render. The export dialog comes up in the orange mode, Export and Render Current Sequence. And before I explain all the settings in this dialog, let's just do the little detour via Lightroom and I'll show you as a second alternative how to do your export from Lightroom instead. The advantages of exporting via Lightroom are the higher quality of the intermediate sequences. Lossless TIFF 16-bit intermediates are possible with LRTimelapse Pro, and the HDR export is also possible with LRTimelapse Pro. Now, before you can export our edits from Lightroom, you must first load the metadata of all images once, so that the images between the keyframes also receive their edits and the deflicker is being applied. To do this, go to Filter and select the complete sequence now. Mark the entire sequence with Ctrl-A on Windows or Command-A on Mac, and now select Metadata, Read Metadata from Files. This will update the images in the Lightroom catalog from the external changes. The next step is now to export the images using the LRT export plugin. If you still have the current import collection activated, please right-click on an image and then click on Go to Folder in Library so that Lightroom jumps to the actual folder. Make sure that all images are selected in the grid view. On the left, select one of the presets, like JPEG 4K, for example, to create intermediate sequences in JPEG and 4K size. LRTimelapse Pro users can also use the corresponding presets to create lossless TIFF and HDR intermediate sequences. Again, define an output folder that is separate from the original files, similar to how we just did it in LRTimelapse. Now go to Export. Now, after finishing the export from Lightroom, the intermediate sequence has been selected automatically in the LRTimelapse render dialog. Since we already did the exporting from Lightroom, now the blue option, Render Pre-Exported Intermediary Sequence, is selected in the render dialog. Now let's talk about the options in the render dialog. LRTimelapse offers some presets at the top left of the render dialog. These are also useful if you're not yet familiar with the specifics of video settings in detail. You can of course adjust these presets if necessary or add your own. For example, you can use the first preset to output a standard HD video at 29.97 frames per second, which is default. This preset uses the common H.264 compression algorithm. Videos that you create with this preset have maximum compatibility with any output device. Basic settings such as the video encoder, the dynamic range, the output size and quality, as well as the frame rate are made on the left. On the top center, you can see the folder in which the intermediate sequence is located and the automatically generated file name. This file name is updated according to the settings you have made. On the right, there are some settings for post-processing. For example, you can set a custom crop with a selectable aspect ratio here. You can use the slider to move the crop and you will see a corresponding rectangle in the preview. Another very useful tool is LRT Motion Blur. The motion blur will basically blend images that are next to each other. Setting of 5, for example, means that 5 images are blended. This produces a very beautiful smooth result and also reduces noise. But the level of motion blur should always be adjusted to the content of the timelapse. With fast-moving timelapses or pans, exaggerated motion blur settings can lead to ghost images. In this case, you can simply re-render the video with a different setting. Higher motion blur settings, the addition of watermarks and timestamps are reserved for the Pro license. Now click on Render to output the final video. The rendering process is displayed in the batch processing list at the bottom left of LRTimelapse and runs in the background. Once the rendering process is complete, the video file is displayed in Explorer or Finder. To re-render another video from an intermediate sequence, you can just reopen the render dialog. Then you can change the settings and re-render, or you can just use the select button to return to a previously exported intermediate sequence at any time in order to re-render it again and try out different motion blur settings, for example. Of course, this also works with intermediate sequences that were created with the internal export. Exported intermediate sequences always start with the prefix LRT_ and are displayed in blue in LRTimelapse. If you hold down the Shift key when clicking on Render, the render dialog will not be closed and you can immediately start the next render process. The exported video files automatically contain information about the render settings in the file name so that you always know which settings you have used, and files with different settings are not being overwritten. Although it might seem complex at first, the workflow is logical and efficient after a few passes. The combination of Lightroom and LRTimelapse allows you to take advantage of all the benefits of Lightroom, including support for all camera raw formats. And even though I highly recommend Lightroom, if you don't have a Lightroom license and don't want to buy it, you can also use the LRTimelapse workflow without Lightroom. Either way, the results are time lapses of incomparable quality. I hope this video helps you to get started with LRTimelapse. I would appreciate a like if it has helped you. You can find more videos on my YouTube channel. It's best to subscribe to it, of course, because new videos are always being added with lots of tips to help you get better and better at working with LRTimelapse. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to come to the LRTimelapse Forum. Many other users write and read there, and I'm there every day to answer your questions. Thanks for watching and see you next time.